In this video, my aim is to compare Book 1 of Homer's Iliad and the Book of Exodus from the Hebrew Bible, in an effort to show that both are works of epic literature that are formed from the same myth base of the Near East, emerging during the archaic Iron Age of the Mediterranean and Levant. Argue that we can interpret Homer's Iliad as through the story of Moses and the Israelites and their exodus from Egypt and subsequent wandering until their eventual sacking of Jericho in the book of Joshua. For all that have read it, we know that the Iliad is actually a pretty complex story that involves multiple plot lines and character developments that occur in parallel, servicing this greater structure of the epic myth. And we don't necessarily think of the Iliad as theological text analogous to Exodus, but that's what I wish to argue in this video, that we can, and more like that we should. We learn about the Greek religion by reading Hesiod's Theogony, or the Bibliothèque of Apollodorus, as this genealogical catalog, much like Genesis, but it is really through Homer that we can understand it, or really cement our knowledge of the symbolism and narrative and its role in perpetuating these common thematic elements as part of the larger epic construction. While the plots and sequences of events of the Iliad and Exodus may not coincide directly if doing a line-by-line comparison between texts, but overall the motifs and characters are able to weather the generations of time, that we can still make this comparison today, 2,500 years later, and we shouldn't expect them to match up like a treasure map or some kind of magic. It's the superficial details and cosmetic additions that make the poet and ultimately the myth, which is the goal of any author, right? Let's be honest, to have their thoughts permeate eternally, shaping human consciousness and thus achieving immortal fame for their craft. When we start off with the Iliad, we are amidst a quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles, and the god Apollo has sent a plague on the Achaeans, or the Greeks, and in the opening line of Homer's epic, he outlines the falling out and the great pain and damage that has been caused through Achilles' anger and stubbornness as a result. And Homer starts off the Iliad here. Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans. Many a brave soul did it send hurrying down to Hades, and many a hero did it yield a prey to dogs and vultures. For so were the counsels of Jove fulfilled from the day on which the son of Atreus, king of men, and great Achilles first fell out with one another.
Ignore the politics.
Apparently you won some great victory.
Perhaps you didn't notice. The Trojan beach belonged to Priam in the morning. It belongs to Agamemnon in the afternoon.
Can I have the beach? I didn't come here for sand.
No. You came here because you want your name to last through the ages. A great victory was won today. But that victory is not yours. Kings did not kneel to Achilles. Kings did not pay homage to Achilles.
Perhaps the kings were too far behind to see. The soldiers won the battle.
History remembers kings, not soldiers. Tomorrow we'll batter down the gates of Troy. I'll build monuments to victory on every island of Greece. I'll carve Agamemnon in the stone. My name will last through the ages. Your name is written in sand for the waves to wash away.
Be careful, King of Kings. First, you need the victory.
Likewise, in Exodus, we start off with the great pain and suffering and the falling out between two central characters, Moses and Pharaoh. And I put forth we can identify Moses as Agamemnon and Achilles as Pharaoh, and furthermore, Yahweh and his angels as this syncretized form of the Greek gods, and Apollo as the god of the Egyptians. Moreover, we can think of Achilles as this symbolic representation, right, as this Aryan leader, as we don't know the Pharaoh's name really as anything other than his title. In a sense, he is this generalized character to represent this civilization, the Egyptians, that will be consumed by the Israelites and bent to the will of Yahweh. And right after the opening line, Homer explains it was Apollo that started the feud between Agamemnon and Achilles. So here, let's read from Homer. And which of the gods was it that sent them on to their quarrel? It was the son of Jove and Leto, for he was angry with the king and sent a pestilence upon the host to plague the people, because the son of Atreus had dishonored Chryses, his priest.
Your men sacked the temple of Apollo, yes?
You want gold? Take it. It's my gift to honor your courage. Take what you wish.
I already have. Afarius! Hemon! Spoils of war.
This would make the case that the Achaeans represent the Israelites, and in Exodus 1 we know it starts off as literally, in the heading, boldface type, oppression of the Israelites. And the narrative goes they are forced into slavery by the Pharaoh, and eventually oppressed due to the faster reproduction rate of the Hebrew women compared to the Egyptians. And with this we can understand the metaphor of the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon and Apollo and the Achaeans, through this lens of racial competition or competing reproductive stratagems. And ultimately, these races represented by figureheads as well as their symbolic deity or gods. And back to the Iliad, as a result of Agamemnon taking Chryseis, the daughter of the priest of Apollo, hostage, the sun god sends a plague and shoots arrows that kills many of the Achaeans. And eventually Achilles gets into a huge fight with Agamemnon over the capture of Chryseis, in order to end the plagues and misery of the Greeks. And this is where the major falling out happens between them referenced in the opening lines of the poem. And in Exodus 2, Moses ends up killing an Egyptian and thus has to flee Egypt, ending up in Midian and marrying the daughter of a priest, which we can understand as the abduction of Chryseis, the daughter of the priest of Apollo, by Agamemnon. And this ends with Moses and the Pharaoh getting into a feud once again, comparable to Achilles and Agamemnon. And this is where it's helpful to analyze these texts in parallel, as they both lend insights into each other and the metaphors being developed in the Iliad and vice versa, confirming Mark Brahmin's JEM theory. If we understand this through the premise of a racial struggle through reproductive competition, we can realize that the plague and attack by Apollo is this counteraction or measures made by the Pharaoh to slow the births of the Hebrews relative to the Egyptians in the beginning of Exodus. This abduction of Chryseis, the priestess of Apollo, is symbolic of this conquest of the Aryan god Apollo, and Achilles, who, like the Pharaoh, is emblematic of the Aryan Egyptian civilization. And furthermore, Zipporah, the wife of Moses, is the seventh daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, where 7 we can associate with Yahweh and this consumption theme of acquiring Aryan genes through marriage. Once again, confirming JEM theory from Mark Brahmin, who postulated the Semitic bride gathering cult on his site, the Apollonian transmission. And back to the comparison, we can imagine Chryseis, the daughter of the priest, as the daughter of the priest of Apollo, as Zipporah, the daughter of the priest of the Midians. Eventually, Achilles argues with Agamemnon about returning Chryseis and gets extremely angry with the king of Argos and nearly kills him. And the goddess Athena stops him by grabbing his yellow hair. And in Exodus 4, Moses, on his return to Egypt, is nearly killed by the Lord or Yahweh, but is saved by his wife Zipporah. And she cuts off the foreskin of her son. And I think we can understand Zipporah saving Moses as like Athena stopping Achilles from taking Agamemnon's life. And moreover, during Achilles' outburst aimed at Agamemnon, is where we find probably the most memorable and interesting lines of Book 1. So here, I'll read. But the son of Peleus again began railing at the son of Atreus, for he was still in a rage. Wine bibber, he cried, with the face of a dog and the heart of a hind. You never dared go out with the host and fight, nor yet with our chosen men in ambuscade. You shun this as you do death itself. You had rather go around and rob his prizes from any man who contradicts you. You devour your people, for you are the king over a feeble folk. Otherwise, son of Atreus, henceforward you would insult no man. Therefore I say, and swear it with a great oath, nay, by this my sceptre, which shall sprout neither leaf nor shoot, nor bud anew, from the day on which it left its parent stem upon the mountains. For the axe stripped it on leaf and bark, and now the sons of the Achaeans bear it as judges and guardians of the decrees of heaven. So surely and solemnly do I swear that henceafter they shall look fondly for Achilles, and shall not find him. In the day of your distress, when your men fall dying by the murderous hand of Hector, you shall not know how to help them, and shall rend your heart with rage for the hour when you offered insult to the bravest of the Achaeans. And I imagine this is the instance where Moses first asked the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go into the wilderness to worship Yahweh. And Pharaoh erupts and calls Moses and the Hebrew people lazy and makes their workload even worse. And they now have to get their own straw, which I understand again as through JEM theory, as this sexual competition for women who can be thought of as resources or like the straw. So the Pharaoh says to Moses, you aren't allowed to use Egyptian women or straw gathered by Egyptians, and have to stay with the Israelite women and gather your own straw or Israelite straw. Using the same metaphor of gathering straw, we can relate this to Achilles telling Agamemnon that he's a coward who profits off others' sweat and blood, but also that he and his men, the Myrmidons, won't fight for Greece anymore. So essentially we can link the soldiers and women as these Aryan resources that needed to be gathered like straw and exploited for benefit by the Semitic leader, either Agamemnon or Moses. Reading further into Homer's Iliad, Book 1. With this, the son of Peleus dashed his gold-besstudded scepter on the ground and took his seat, while the son of Atreus was beginning fiercely from his place upon the other side. Then uprose smooth-tongued Nestor, the facile speaker of the Pylians, and the words fell from his lip sweeter than honey. 2 generations of men born and bred in Pylos, and had passed away under his rule, and he was now reigning over the third. With all sincerity and goodwill, therefore, he addressed them thus. And this, I propose, resembles Exodus 7, where the Pharaoh's priests throw down his staff, and then Aaron throws down his staff right after, and they transform into snakes, and Aaron eats the Egyptian staff up. And again, we can understand Nestor as like the biblical Aaron, this legitimizing force for the medium between God and man, or between God, Moses, and man, where Moses is inarticulate and insecure. So Yahweh commands him to give his staff to Aaron and have Aaron speak for him in order to convince and persuade the Israelites and ultimately the Pharaoh and Egyptians to submit to the will of Yahweh. And along the same lines, we can think of Nestor as always keeping the Achaeans and Agamemnon from giving up and deserting the mission of sacking Troy. But he's also in the predicament where he has to play good cop to Agamemnon's bad cop with regard to Achilles. And we see this with Aaron in Exodus, albeit later on, when he runs into trouble with the growing discontent with the Israelites when they question if they should have ever left Egypt in the first place and listened to Moses, right? And the Greek camp is fickle as well, and Agamemnon wields both staff and Nestor to control the sentiments of the soldiers and keep their morale high and towards the goal of sacking Troy, like the Israelites want to make it to Canaan in the land of milk and honey. So from Homer, furthermore, not a man now living could withstand them, but they heard my words and were persuaded by them. So be it also with yourselves, for this is more excellent way. Therefore, Agamemnon, though you be strong, take not this girl away, for the sons of the Achaeans have already given her to Achilles, and you, Achilles, strive not further with the king, for no man who by the grace of Jove wields a scepter has like honor with Agamemnon. So, akin to Achilles throwing down his staff in front of Agamemnon, and then Nestor coming in to speak right after, like in Exodus 7, with the Pharaoh and his magic men come down and throw down their staffs, and they each become snakes, but they're all eaten up by Aaron's. We can also easily imagine as this like allegory for the theme so far of a sexual rivalry between civilizations and races, with competing fertility rates, and here we see this literal dick measuring contest, it seems. And here, let's read from Exodus. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Perform a miracle,' then say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake.'" And so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same things by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. And back to a line from the Iliad that I said was probably the most interesting, where Achilles throws down his scepter. I find it more interesting more so in what Achilles says before he throws his scepter, and that it reveals what I ultimately think the character of Achilles will represent in the Iliad. His capitulation to Agamemnon and sexual cuckoldry as Agamemnon goes on to steal his bride of war, Briseis, and Achilles makes this oath where his staff serves as a device for allegorical reference to basically cutting off his genetic line by submitting sexual prowess to Agamemnon. And we can also understand this as this covenant of circumcision, right, where he describes the staff being cut by an axe and stripped of its bark, and he swears is it in bear of witnesses to this oath to the gods in heavens or Olympus. It's a covenant. Here, let's read. It's very interesting. "Therefore I say, and swear with a great oath, nay, by this my scepter, which shall sprout neither leaf nor shoot, nor bud anew from the day on which it has left its parent stem upon the mountains. For the axe stripped it of leaf and bark, and now the sons of the Achaeans bear it as judges and guardians of the decrees of heaven. So surely and solemnly do I swear that hereafter they shall look fondly for Achilles, and shall not find him. In the day of your distress, when your men fall dying, by the murderous hands of a Hector, you shall not know how to help them, and you shall rend your heart with rage for the hour when you offered insult to the bravest of the Achaeans." Furthermore, Achilles says, "in the day of your distress," which I'm not sure if this is actually the best translation from the original Greek verse, but Achilles' name literally means distress, and that's how we know him from the opening lines as this character who brings woe and ultimately distress on the Greeks. And relaying this way of the book of Exodus, the Israelites are being oppressed by the Pharaoh, and until eventually Yahweh will supersede in the clash between Moses and the Egyptians. And after the argument between Achilles and Agamemnon, it's agreed to send back Chryseis to her father to appease Apollo, to stop the plague and mayhem he's causing in the Greek camp as a result of the kidnapping. And Achilles goes his separate way with his clan, the Myrmidons, and it cries alone by the seashore. And once again, we can understand this as when the Pharaoh makes the Israelites gather their own straw and cuts them off from the access to the Egyptian gathered straw, like Achilles is cutting off Agamemnon from his soldiers, the Myrmidons. But here, let's read where Achilles goes off on his own in the Iliad. "But Achilles abode at his ships and nursed his anger. He went not to the honorable assembly, and sallied not forth to fight, but gnawed at his own heart, pining for battle in the war cry." Again, we can understand Achilles as distress, but also through the epic, as I interpret, the covenant between God and man. And we can think of this covenant or oath as this lifetime struggle that literally gnaws at your heart, so to speak, right? And by the end of the Exodus, we understand the covenant and the consecration of it as explained in the text, as this religious ceremony involving blood and dripping it around the feet. And it's really an odd thing, right? It's from the Bronze Age. And this matches the part of Exodus where Moses is nearly killed by the Lord or Yahweh at a lodging place on his way back to Egypt, but he's saved by his wife Zipporah, and she does this weird sacrament, right, where she circumcises her son and pours the blood at Moses' feet, and it's like this odd thing, even by Bronze Age standards, to think something so barbaric as like cutting your son's penis and dripping blood in this kind of oath of allegiance, right? In the Old Testament, the circumcision is the covenant with God, but in reality, it's a metaphor for the Hebrew religion and its aim to acquire Aryan women and castrate or emasculate the male competitors, and Homer's description of Bronze Age ceremony and religious sacrifice is more familiar, where we understand, right, this kind of like concept of Bronze Age religious ceremony. And this is like right after returning Chryseis to her father to pray to Apollo and offer him sacrifices of appeasement, right? And they lay wood on the fire and poured wine over them. And we see this link here with wine as this analogous to blood, most likely a mixed relationship of a Semitic father and Aryan mother, if we go right according to the JEM by Mark Brahmin. And think of the blood that Zipporah pours from the circumcision of her son Gershom and pours at Moses' feet. And we can assume Moses is Jewish, and right? And Zipporah is Egyptian or Midian or Aryan, right? And here, let's read from Book 1 of Iliad to get more familiar, right? This is what probably more familiar as far as a Bronze Age sacrifice and ceremony. Thus did he pray, and Apollo heard his prayer. When they had done praying and sprinkling the barley meal, they drew back the heads of the victims and killed and flayed them. They cut off the thigh bones, wrapped them around in 2 layers of fat, set some pieces of raw meat on top of them, and then Chryseis laid them on the wood fire and poured wine over them, while the young men stood near him with 5-pronged spits in their hands. When the thigh bones were burned, and they had tasted the inward meats, they cut the rest up small, put the pieces upon the smiths, and roasted them till they were done, and drew them off. Then they had finished their work, and the feast was ready. They ate it, and every man had his full share, so that all were satisfied. As soon as they had enough to eat and drink, pages filled the mixing bowl with wine and water, and handed it around, after giving every man his drinking offering. So right, we can use JEM theory to link the wine mixing and ceremony with Chryseis and Agamemnon in the Iliad as the blood sacrament or blood from the circumcision of Gershom, this mixed-race child of Moses, the Semitic father, and Zipporah, the Aryan mother. At the end of Book 1 in the Iliad, Achilles cries to his mother Thetis, and he pleads with her to ask Zeus to give Achilles his glory, since it's prophesied he'll die in Troy. And to reach this aim, Zeus will have to give favor to the Trojans, so Agamemnon will realize he needs Achilles to fight. And this scene is where we get this famous painting, as Thetis is said to grab Zeus by his chin. And all the while, jealous Hera is watching and conspiring in the background in secret. And this is because she favors the Greeks, ultimately, and is worried Thetis will successfully convince Zeus to help Achilles, and thus helping the Trojans. And you might say, hey, you missed a good chunk of Exodus, like the burning bush, and skipped around. And I would say, yeah, that's how myths or these epics work, where you have these episodic chunks, and where we can compare these chunks to other parts of myths that are the same, but set to different timelines, or where everything is similar, where in analyzing the characters, themes, and symbols, but plots can't be analyzed directly, line by line. I'd have to think Homer or other bards would perform only 2 books or so at a time, like an episode of a TV show today in a series. And when comparing books 1 and 2 of the Iliad to, say, the range of Exodus 1 to Exodus 7, argue we have all the same events, plot-wise, happening in parallel, just not concurrently, with respect to a direct verse-by-verse analysis. It's not a recitation. And because of the similarities and differences of the texts, through an analysis one can confirm and advance REM theory, and more specifically JEM, where you have basically the same myth being told to 2 different audiences, and ultimately the audiences are moralized in opposite ways, where the Greek epic of the Iliad has this unsympathetic Semitic character of Agamemnon, in a feud with the tragic yet sympathetic Aryan figure in Achilles, and the reverse is true for Exodus, where the Semitic Moses is inspiring and a heroic leader, and the Pharaoh is this like impotent and cold-hearted figure. And you have to understand the audience of each of these epics, where the Hebrew Bible and Book of Exodus is intended for Jewish people and to moralize them, and also to endear them to Gentiles. And Homer writes or performs his poem for an Aryan Greek audience, where the figure of Achilles is tragic and kind of pitiful, where he eventually submits to Agamemnon and fights his battle while gaining his eternal glory. But if you understand JEM, it is the Semitic Agamemnon who comes out on top of the Iliad. He has the Greek soldiers fight for him, including the mightiest of all, Achilles, and even gaining access to his woman in the process. Well, I hope you enjoyed this analysis of Book 1 of Homer's Iliad and the Biblical Exodus, chapters 1 through 7, and be on the lookout for further explorations into Book 2 of the Iliad, and once again, books 1 through 7 of Exodus.